In this video, I am going to show you how to tell whether your straw bales are ready to plant in. I'm going to show you exactly how we plant in the straw bales, and then I'll take you on a little tour and show you what we've planted in the straw bales so far and talk about support of the plants and fertilizing the straw bales. So this is part 2 in our series of how to grow in straw bales. We love straw bale gardening and grow a ton of food in them. And the first thing you're going to need to do, if you haven't seen it already, is go and find part 1 on how to condition the bales. I'll put a link somewhere up there so you guys can see that. So these bales have already been conditioned, which is basically started composting. And the first question would be, how do I tell whether or not the bale is safe to plant in? So if you remember from the previous video, one of the things we saw as we added fertilizer to the straw bale is it would heat up really hot, and now it started to cool down. And there's a few indicators that show me this is ready to plant in. The first is just using a compost thermometer. One of the things we can see is we're just a little under 80 degrees Fahrenheit inside the bale. Just for reference, it's about 50 some degrees outside today. So it's warmer than the ambient temperature, but it used to be really hot and now it's cooled down. And actually that little added warmth is one of the reasons I really love straw bale gardening in the early season, because I'm going to be planting this pumpkin, which loves warm soil. The other indicators we're going to see is if you look at the bale, you're going to see all sorts of life coming out of it. We always get these mushrooms kind of later on, and when the mushrooms show up, generally the temperature is down lower, and it's a good indicator that now the bale's ready to plant in. The other thing we're going to see is we actually have wheat growing in the straw bale, and of course wheat won't germinate at really high temperatures, and you tend to see that starting to germinate once the bale has been conditioned and cooled down a little bit. So Hillary's behind the camera today, and so if there are things that don't make sense, she's going to check me and ask questions. So hopefully I can answer all of your questions that you might have. But we've established this bale is now ready to plant in, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to plant this champion pumpkin in the straw bale. So what I need to do is I need to make some sort of planting hole, and that's obviously going to be a little bit more difficult than just planting in the dirt, because I can't just stick my hand in there. We've tried a bunch of different methods. In fact, one year we used a post hole digger where we kind of put that in and then we spread the straw apart and then put them in there. But the method I found actually works a little bit better is to use one of these mini augers on an electric drill. So I'm going to make a hole right here for this pumpkin, and I'll show you how I plant it. So in this case, my plan is to only plant one thing, just this pumpkin in the bale. So I'm going to go right in the middle, and then I'm just going to take my auger. I'm going to basically spread out some of the straw, and you'll see since it's partially broken down, it'll sort of rip it up and make a little hole. What I found is with these thinner augers, if you look at the size of the pot, kind of spinning it around like that helps. Now, especially with these family of plants, they don't like their roots disturbed, and so you don't really want to jam it in there. And so I generally will come in here just with my hands and kind of do some refinements to the hole. Just make sure it's the right size. You can see the straw just sort of rips apart at this point. So that looks pretty good as far as the size goes. Gonna get this pumpkin out of here. With any sort of cucurbit plant, you don't want to pull on the vine when you're pulling this out, because you can separate it. They're not as hardy as, say, a tomato or a pepper. Don't forget your label. So I'm going to put this in here. It's just going to rest right in there. And then the nice thing about the auger is it created all this extra. One thing I'm going to do is I just have a little air gap here, so I'm going to go on the edges and I'm just going to push the straw so it makes better contact with the plant. And then I'm going to use the straw that popped up with the auger just to kind of mulch the top of that. One of the questions people might have is, do I need to add any soil? In general, no. The roots are actually going to go into the straw, so you don't need to add soil. The only exception to that is if you're trying to direct sow something. Let's say I was trying to do green beans, for example. The green beans or any sort of seed needs good, what we call seed to soil contact. And because there's so much air in the straw, it doesn't work very well to just put the green bean in the straw. So in that case, you'd want to create a little area of soil, could be any sort of potting mix, and place the green bean in there and then water it in. All right, so now that we've planted our pumpkin, you can tell that's pretty straightforward. I am gonna just water it in just like I would into a normal raised bed. And I'm gonna use a little bit of liquid fertilizer. One of the fertilizers I really like in general, but also for straw bales, is AgroThrive. So it's a 3-3-2. And it does add a little bit of phosphorus and potassium. Remember, we've conditioned the bales mostly with nitrogen, so they tend to have pretty decent nitrogen, but you need to make sure that you have that potassium and phosphorus in there. The other option would be to spread some all-purpose granular fertilizer on the top of the bale, and then just every time you water, allow that to come in. So in this bucket, I've actually got rainwater, and I've already mixed a little bit of the AgroThrive in there. So I'm just going to gently water that in. And that should do it. So now that we know when it's safe to plant in the straw bales, how to plant in them, I wanted to talk just about a few other things. The first is keeping the bales watered while they're growing. And one of the things you can see is there's a lot of other stuff around the straw bale. You can see these logs right here and a bunch of shredded leaves. And one of the things I found that works really well is to basically put some organic material around the straw bale. That way the, ew, that's fertilizer. Anyway, that way the sides of the straw bale don't dry out as quickly. The straw bales in general are very well draining, so you don't really need to worry about them getting too waterlogged. But when you're watering, you don't want to douse them with too much water, because what happens is a lot of that nitrogen is in the soil from the breakdown of the bacteria, and then of course whatever you're fertilizing, and if you put too much plain water, you're going to basically wash out that nitrogen and other fertilizer, and it won't be available to your plants. Let's go around and look at some of the other things that we planted in the straw bales, and also talk a little bit about support of the plants while we're there. So right up in the foreground, there's actually 3 straw bales, including the one that we just planted in. These are our pumpkins. We have the Long Island cheese pumpkins. These did really well for us last year because they're actually in the same species as butternut squash, so they're more resistant to squash vine borer. And then we have traditional pumpkins because Hillary, who's behind the camera, requested that we have more of a traditional orange pumpkin. So we'll see whether or not those survive the squash vine borer that inevitably comes. Right here, there's nothing planted in these. This is actually going to have our sweet potatoes, but we haven't planted our slips yet. But one of the things we can talk about is the support that we have. Last year, we had our sweet potatoes and they just sprawled out everywhere. And one of the things we found is they made small sweet potatoes everywhere they rooted. And so we ended up getting a lot of smaller sweet potatoes instead of a few bigger ones. So what I'm going to do this time is train the vines up this cattle panel. And this is sort of one of the go-to ways that I like to trellis these. These are 8-foot T-posts in the ground, and then this is a 16-foot cattle panel. And in this case, it's usually about 5 straw bales that goes the 16 feet, and I usually put 4 of the 8-foot T-posts in to support that. You can see them over this way as well. I've got a couple more sort of beds of straw bales here. If we go around this way, we could probably walk easier. And let's talk about these. So this entire row, it's actually 2 cattle panels. These are all of our melons. So think cantaloupe, and then we grew a really big variety of melons this year. I'm gonna have them up this trellis, and then one of the things that we're gonna use are these little ball nets here. So the melons will grow, and as they develop, we put the melon inside the ball net and then hook it to the cattle panel. And then as it gets heavy, a lot of these melons, they slip from the vine. So what that means is that when the melon is ripe, it actually detaches from the vine. And so it's pretty amazing. You basically just walk out here and there's a cantaloupe just sitting in your bag, and you can go back inside and enjoy it. So we've got all of these here. Let's kind of just zoom in a little bit here, because these have just been in the ground a couple days, and we can see there's already some really nice new growth on here. And it just means they're doing really well, enjoying that extra heat that the straw bales provide in comparison to the in-ground, which the ground temperature is still usually about 60 degrees or so right now. It'll warm up very soon. On the other side, over this way, we have our watermelon. And I've got 3 different varieties of watermelon here. 2 of them are Anza. I just planted this one. These ones have been in the straw bales a few more days, and you can see how much growth they've put on. Anza is a seedless watermelon. So this is actually the first year we were able to successfully germinate those, and hopefully we'll get seedless watermelon, so I don't have to pick all those seeds out for the kids. Ace is actually a pollinizer for Anza, because seedless watermelon require a different watermelon in order to pollinate. They can't pollinate themselves. And then we have our sort of go-to one that we grew a lot of last year. And this one's a sugar baby watermelon here. It does have seeds, but it did really well for us last year. We got quite a lot of watermelon. Let me show you a couple other ways that we're supporting our plants and show you some tomatoes that we have in straw bales as well. I've got 3 tomatoes here in these straw bales, and these are indeterminate tomatoes, meaning they just vine and vine and vine. And the way I'm supporting those are with these 10-foot EMT conduits, and I just have a cross space brace to keep those from moving around. One of the things we can look at if we come in this way are these tomato plants here. This was planted just yesterday, and you can see actually all of this is new growth here. You can see the new growth leaves, and they just look really nice and healthy. These plants just love the extra warmth in the early season that the straw bales provide. The thing I just planted literally an hour ago are all of our determinate tomatoes. These I started a week or 2 after the indeterminate, so they're smaller plants. They're just easier to plant in the straw bales when they're smaller. And so let me show you those and how I'm supporting them. So these 3 rows have our determinate tomato plants. So those are the bush tomatoes. They're all paste tomatoes. We grow a few hundred pounds of paste tomatoes every year, and straw bales are our go-to way of doing that. This year what I did is, the only thing different is the way I'm supporting them. So last year the beds actually had 2 straw bales together, and then I used those tomato cages thinking that since they're bush type tomatoes that they are going to be sufficient as far as holding them up. That was not the case. They got really big and really heavy, and towards the end of the season they just all started flopping on each other. So what I decided to do this year, we'll see if it works, is I bent a 16-foot cattle panel into sort of this V shape, or sort of a taco, and then there's these T-posts here with wire supporting them. So you can see they're very, very rigid and able to hold a lot of weight. And then these tomatoes will kind of grow in there. The foliage will not be on the ground anymore, because that's actually one thing that happened when everything fell over last year. And I'm very excited about it. We'll see if it works. If it does, I'll do a more comprehensive video about kind of how I set it up. so you guys can replicate it. Look for that in the future, assuming I like it at the end of the season. So that should give you good insight into how to know when your bales are ready to plant in, how to plant in them, and then just a few ideas as far as how to support your plants once you've planted in your straw bales. We also talked a little bit about fertilizer. Now, I tried to cover all the things that most people would ask, but if you have questions that I didn't answer, please let me know in the comments. I'm happy to answer them. I got a lot of work to do, and I do promise we'll be doing kind of a full walkthrough video soon. If you don't want to miss that and you're not a subscriber, go ahead and subscribe to our channel. Happy gardening, everyone.